Hello everyone, and welcome to the last video in this series. I'm going to try to condense this one as much as possible because I know the last three were kind of long, and since you all have read, I don't need to go over, these concepts in depth as the other ones. I try to just pick the ones that I think would be most confusing for you. So, without further ado, let's cover the humanistic existential model and progress through the rest of the text. So the humanistic existential model is going to focus on the philosophical goals. So I ended the last video saying, cognitive behavioral approach looks at, thoughts and behaviors, but it doesn't analyze the deeper questions. Well, that's where the humanistic existential model comes in. Humanistic, think of it as like the hippie go free of the psychological domain, because it's looking at that self-reflection, and it was very prominent in the 60s and 70s. And it's looking at those philosophical goals. The humanistic perspective in particular looks at the capacity for good that lies within all people. And the existential model is a bit more somber in that it says that, people are just trying to be their authentic selves. So in my picture here is this is Jean-Paul Sartre. He was an existentialist, which basically they believe that life doesn't really have meaning unless you give it meaning, so how you're living. So existentialists are looking at how we are being authentic and how we live, and humanists are more optimistic, saying humans have this capacity for good and to be self-fulfilling. They're friendly, cooperative, and constructive by nature. And so this is going to affect abnormal functioning in that it's looking at how we kind of view ourselves and our authentic selves comparative to others. And I'm going to get to this with Carl Rogers because he addresses heavily in his conditions of worth. And so Carl Rogers was a prominent humanistic psychology that I mentioned briefly in my Psych 150 classes because he revolutionized how we view therapy. It was very warm under his approach and client-centered, so the client takes the lead. We kind of nurture the client, as opposed to psychotherapy, which was a bit more distant. So Carl Rogers believed that therapists have three traits that need to be expressed to the client, and these are derived from his conditions of worth, and I'm going to explain those in depth after I address the three traits of a therapist. But unconditional positive regard, so viewing the client in a positive light always, without it's not conditional, meaning that if they say something that sounds totally horrible to a lay person, for example, saying like, I murdered a bunch of people and I'm really sorry about it, they still are going to view that patient with unconditional positive regard as a human with capacity to change and all that kind of stuff. Accurate empathy. So, trying to understand the client, and genuineness, having open and sincere communication. Now, these are important, he said, because these will help people to understand and to fulfill themselves under the conditions of worth. So, in essence, Carl Rogers looked at how positive regard and unconditional positive regard, as we develop, let's say our parents, because that's a prominent caretaking force in our life. Our parents are guardian figures. If they give a child unconditional positive regard, always view the child in a positive light and help fulfill their learning, that positive regard will lead to unconditional self-regard. They will view themselves in a positive light and be able to reach their fulfilling potential. And things should go really well for them. But if a parent exercises a conditional type of love, where maybe they'll reprimand the child for being themselves. For example, if the child doesn't meet the parents' expectations in terms of sexuality. Unfortunately, that's a reality in our country. That parent may take away that regard, may take away that love, and make it seem like there are conditions through which they will dole out that appreciation. Okay, and when there are conditions put forth, some people believe they can't be themselves. Truly. So they may change how they act around certain people. And so with humanism, it's all about finding that authentic self, this humanistic and existential approach. It's about finding the authentic self and acting as your true self. So, when you're in a therapy session, you're trying to live with greater meaning. You're trying to confront kind of those phony selves that you've put on based on the conditions that were put forth onto you. Now, the humanistic existential model is great because that appeals to a lot of people. We're looking at this positive psychology, how we can live to ourselves. It sounds kind of frou-frou, so people like it. Sometimes we need a little bit of that, right? It's positive, it's optimistic, it's uplifting. It views people in a positive light despite what has happened to them, and it views them outside of their illness. But it does have limitations because it's very hard to research, and it also hasn't had good support in research. So I think sometimes we look at these models with kind of a pragmatic approach in what works for that client in that circumstance. It's not very systematic. The sociocultural model, moving forward. And again, I know we're discussing a lot of models, but this is very important because when we reference these models, we're going to look at all these different psychological disorders as we move through this course. And when we look at the different adapting, the different models and adapt them, we're going to see how those models view this scenario. So that's why we're covering so much, because there's so much about people to understand. And different models are going to be in agreement or in conflict, and that's what we're going to talk about later. The sociocultural model is looking at exactly what it says there. Our social kind of roles and our culture, and how those affect how we view ourselves. So abnormal behavior is going to be best understood by considering the broad forces at work. So our norms, roles, culture, maybe even religion sometimes, because that affects our culture. And so just to understand that in full, I put a definition of culture here. The set of values, attitudes, beliefs, history, and behaviors shared by a group of people and communicated from one generation to the next. These are all things that can affect our mental health. But if we're particularly looking at the family social perspective, we're looking at how the family creates this social dynamic for us to foster or inhibit us. So, how is behavior explained in the family social model? Well, we have social labels. Now, I think the easiest way to define this is to use the example of the word crazy. Have you ever heard, seen someone talking to themselves on the street and maybe heard someone say, make a comment, a family member about, there's that crazy guy, right? Well, that label has a very negative connotation, and it's very dismissive of the severity of the issues within that person's life. So in psychology, we don't use the word crazy because it dismisses people. And not only does it shape how we view them, but how they view themselves. So being labeled with such insensitive things can affect how they work through problems. We're also going to look at social connections and supports. So how does someone interact or reach out to others? We're going to analyze their social life in a sense. Do they have a tendency to reach out to their peers at work? Or are they like, no, I'm fine. I'm an introvert. I like being home. I don't like talking to people at work. Or maybe they prefer to interact with people online that are like them. That's what we're looking at. How do people make those social connections, and how are they supported in their lives? And we're also going to look at the family structure here. So the family systems theory is very important for this because it views the family as a system of interacting parts whose interactions exhibit consistent patterns and unstated rules. So I'm sure you can think about in your family, maybe your mom or dad has ever reprimanded you for doing something, misbehaving or doing something in front of the family that seemed uncouth or unacceptable, right? Well, our families put forth their own dynamics of what's acceptable conduct. And sometimes these systems can lead to abnormal functioning. Sometimes we have parents who are over-involved with their children's lives, right? Or maybe, like you always see those jokes about dads being protective of their daughters' sexuality. That is an example of over-involvement, right? Without showing too much judgment on my part, when I see that, it's a bit strange to me as a psych person, because that exhibits over-involvement and has the potential to cause some abnormal functioning among the daughter, right? Maybe the daughter, as a result of that, will try to hide things, will try to rebel. It can lead to abnormal functioning. That abnormal functioning within the familial unit can lead to further consequences. So with the family social unit, since we're looking at how people interact socially, that's the main component. How do they interact with other people? Because as humans, we are social creatures. Different treatments involving groups. So group therapy is usually a group of people who have a similar problem, and it's led by a professionally trained therapist. A self-help group is similar. So these are people with similar issues, maybe like AA or different kind of prevention groups, substance abuse groups, but these are going to be led by other people who have the same problems. Everyone's kind of leading it together, facilitating the group together. There's no strict, professionally trained leader. Then you have family therapy, which looks at the whole familial unit. So for example, I had a friend who was putting her child in therapy, and she was asking me why her kid was doing A, B, and C. And I'm not a therapist, but I have studied psychology and theory. It's kind of the idea like, if you have a toxic family environment, and so the kid is misbehaving, and you take the kid out and send him to therapy, well, that's great for the hour they're in therapy, but what happens when you put them back in the toxic family environment? Right, so that's the point of family therapy. We need to address that whole unit, that toxic unit sometimes, Sometimes it is toxic. Sometimes it's not, right? We're including the family in the therapeutic process, because they need to learn how to address the needs of an individual. That is the target individual. Then we have couples therapy, or like marriage therapy, because despite the happiest of couples you've seen, especially those wonderful influencers on YouTube, they do have marital discord. And couple therapy is not just for people who are married. It can be also long-term relationship. Everyone's going to fight in their relationship. I'll be candid. My husband and I, after having kids, we're like different people, right? But it's all about communication and opening up and kind of exercising that between that intimate duo. Or I guess throuple, if people do that too. Now, then we have community treatment, which is just seeking, again, looking at those social relationships, but on a broad scale. So if we're treating mental health, we're treating it in an area and a scenery that is familiar. So you have first, secondary, and tertiary prevention. So this is kind of very much focused on preventing things from getting worse rather than reacting, right? So first we're trying to change community mindset about mental health, so challenging stigmas. Secondary, we're trying to address minor psychological disorders and abnormal functioning before they get worse. And tertiary is kind of more treating, so it doesn't become a systemic or long-lasting issue. When we talk about multicultural theories and treatment, we're shifting a little bit away from that family social, but we're still looking at that social component, because culture has so many social components in how we create norms, how we establish behaviors, our values, our attitudes, and it's important to have an understanding of culture and how it affects people's mental health. So an individual's behavior is best understood in their cultural context. So what does that mean? If you are a white woman like myself, and you are doling out therapy to someone who is black, you have to have an understanding of, you won't understand firsthand. You won't, no matter how hard you try. But it's important to be empathetic and to try to understand. So knowing that there's a possibility that person has faced prejudice and discrimination throughout their life, or felt that burden throughout their life, knowing societal pressures put upon that group is very important for any group that you are trying to help. Having that understanding of how culture plays into someone's mental health is very important, because experiencing prejudice and discrimination especially now in a time when it's so talked about because we keep seeing these injustices being played out. Understanding how that affects people of color and their perceptions of themselves and how that affects their mental health and stress is very important. And it goes much deeper than that. And so for treatment, it's important to develop culture-sensitive therapies. In the past, it wasn't that big of a topic, but as we've been researching and discovering more about the efficacy of it, we've understood that there is a need to be sensitive to cultural issues and include those cultural morals and values in treating people. So it's important to be knowledgeable and being open. Here's a wonderful video about the challenges and rewards of a culturally informed approach to mental health. I've included it here as well as in your supplementary materials because it goes much deeper than the surface. I feel like our textbook kind of scratches the surface. But Dr. Jessica Dare gives a great example of, she paints a hypothetical scenario for a client you're working with, to kind of uncover the biases you have and how culture plays a role in our perceptions and how we treat psychological disorders. Because someone from the same scenario may be viewed differently based on their culture. So you have to watch the video to figure out what I'm talking about, because I'm not going to spoil it. Let me go to the next slide. And the last thing we talk about is integrating models. When you integrate something, you're bringing it together. So no one model is superior that we've talked about. They all have great points. They all have limitations. And so when we're drawing these conclusions of these models, we notice that a lot of these can fit together. We can draw from other approaches, right? Like the cognitive behavioral model is already bringing together the cognitive and behavioral fields of psychology. So we have, for example, the biopsychosocial theory, which looks at biological components, psychological components, and social components of abnormal functioning. We're already drawing in all of these forces to analyze people from multiple domains. And so when we're looking at the developmental psychopathology perspective, it's kind of bringing in a little bit of everything, and it's not saying, hey, there's this one factor, like, hey, there's just a biological component, we found it, let's fix it, right? It's bringing in all these factors together and looking at them across the lifespan. So we're not looking at one specific factor, we're looking at a bunch of them, and in what context, and at what time. So that's what we're looking at here. So I put some examples, like biologically, you can look at brain and genetic factors, how someone's brain develops over time and over their lifespan, right? What interruptions or problems may they have? Psychodynamic perspective, object relations theory, looking at how they formed relationships throughout their life. How does that contribute to their abnormal functioning? And then we have the cognitive behavioral model. Again, looking at their thought processes and behaviors. How have those behaviors been reinforced? How have those thought processes developed? So you get my point with that. It's very important to bring those all together, because the final thought I want to leave you with is just that there are multiple pathways to dysfunction, multiple ways we can look at it. These models set forth kind of guidelines through which we view different scenarios and situations and as they pertain to abnormal functioning. So the models are going to kind of inform how we go about diagnosing and treating the different psychopathologies. And so there's a possibility, what we're going to look at throughout this text is how people develop these psychological disorders, because it's not clear-cut, right? We have different pathways that can lead to the same psychological disorders. This is called equifinality. So sometimes you can have two people with obsessive-compulsive disorder, and they can have extremely different pathways to coming to that disorder. Maybe one person just had an obsessive thought one day and it just ran with it. Maybe another person has a biological component and a brain functioning issue that has led them to have severe obsessive-compulsive disorder. Whereas multifinality looks at how people with similar developmental histories may react to similar situations in different ways. So you could have two people, maybe they had a good childhood, parents divorced when they were in their teenage years, they rebounded pretty well, they both work full-time and share similar experiences as a woman. Well, maybe they both get fired, right? They both have developmentally similar backgrounds, they both have the same experience, but they react differently. One sees it as an opportunity to move, get a tiny house, start an Instagram page, and become an influencer, whereas the other one falls into a state of despair and depression. So what causes those different reactions? There's so many intricacies to people and abnormal functioning that we're going to discover throughout this text. That's all I have for this chapter. I know this was long and I'm really sorry. But if you got through these videos, good for you. If you have any questions, let me know.